About 40 years ago, the state of Michigan started the process of converting old railroad lines into recreation trails with its Rails to Trails program. Today, these trails are used on a daily basis for walking, running, biking, and other sporting activities. Here in the city of Rochester, the Paint Creek Trail runs off to the northwest, while the Clinton River Trail borders the south side of town.
If you follow these trails back in time, you can discover the industrial history of the city of Rochester and get lost in the treasure hunt of the city's past. I'm Jason, and Michigan, this is your history. When I started planning this episode, the goal was to walk along the Riverwalk here in downtown Rochester, check out some of the more interesting historical markers, dive into the archives, and try to find the primary sources that support the stories written on these markers.
Well, these markers share interesting bits of facts and stories that make up the history of our state. The stories are just the end product of the best part of history. The most interesting part of exploring history is the journey to discover the truth behind these stories.
The change in planning came when I encountered this historical marker just north of the Clinton River Trail.
On this site was built one of the oldest industrial mills in Rochester. Initially, the mill that stood here turned grain into flour, but eventually it was purchased by the Barnes brothers and turned into a paper mill. It's the line below the picture that would cause the most trouble and prove to be the most interesting part of my search. It reads, "The mill was destroyed in 1875 by a fire started by a disgruntled employee. Owner William Barnes rebuilt the structure with a slate roof to lessen the fire hazard."
One might think that a story about arson would be simple to source and track down, but the origins of this marker proved to be a difficult suspect to find.
We know that a paper mill did exist in this location in 1875. I came across a map of Rochester, Michigan that was made in 1872, and the Barnes paper mill is clearly labeled on the map. The problem was that no modern account or contemporary account actually had all the details of what happened during 1875. What is not present on the marker is an exact date or name of the employee which started the fire or the reason for the crime. For those interested in the history of Rochester, Michigan, a locally run blog called Remembering Rochester contains lots of great information about the history of the area. Included with this blog was a much longer history in the mill and more details about the fire which destroyed the mill in 1875. While the blog post does not cite original sources for its historical account, the details it does provide greatly helps us in our adventure to find the original sources. You can find a link to Remembering Rochester in the description of this video. In order to sort out what happened, we need to start building a timeline of the events. So far, we have been told the fire occurred in 1875, so while that helps, it does not really narrow down our searching very much. Very quickly, historians will discover that searching old newspapers can be a difficult prospect. The tools that search the archives are not as powerful as the ones we use on a daily basis. In addition, optical character recognition, which is the type of software used to make the old newspapers searchable, does not always make complete sense of the content. Of course, there is the problem that papers from this time period may be heavily damaged or missing altogether. To make our searching more productive, we really need to have a small range of dates. What the Remembering Rochester article adds is that the fire occurred on a Sunday. Working with that, we can hopefully narrow down the fire to 52-ish possible dates. Not great, but it's better than 365 days.
When I was trying to find the exact date of the fire, I discovered something that really wanted to make me dive into the details of this incident.
This book in front of me is a copy of the History of Oakland County, Michigan with illustrations from 1877. In the chapter on Rochester, Michigan, the book contained an entry in the Barnes Brothers paper mill fire. It reads, "In 1867 to 68, the mill was remodeled by the Barnes brothers, who put into it paper-making machinery and operated it as a paper mill until June 1875, during which month it was destroyed by fire." First, we have a month for the fire, but from this short account we are also missing something. There is no mention of arson as a crime.
Now, this book is not a primary source. It's a collection of historical accounts. So therefore, if the author knew the fire at the paper mill was a criminal act, it was a fact they chose to leave out.
Back to our timeline, we are looking at a possible Sunday fire in June. It is not an exact date yet, but I had enough information to get a lucky hit with a newspaper archive. On June 14, 1875, which was a Monday, the Pittsburg Daily Commercial had a short blurb about the Barnes Brothers paper mill fire. It read, "Detroit, June 14. Barnes Brothers paper mill at Rochester, Michigan was burned yesterday. The loss is not stated." On the next day, June 15th, we see a similar short entry in the Lawerence Daily Journal from Kansas. "Detroit, June 14th. Barnes Brothers paper mill at Rochester, Michigan burned yesterday. Loss not stated." Finally, the news after this event concludes with this entry in the Detroit Free Press on June 16th, 1875. Barnes Brothers Insurance and their paper mill at Rochester, Oakland County aggregated, I can't read this number exactly, and was distributed among 17 companies. I would like to add a few notes on the Detroit Free Press entry. The value of the loss of the factory is generally stated around $32,000. It is very likely that that value comes from the Detroit Free Press article, as it is possible that the number I couldn't read very well is $32,530. Personally, I think it reads $22,530, but the number is difficult to read, and the exact value of the mill does not really matter for the purposes of this particular story. Also, the 17 companies comment appears to mean that the insurance for the mill was provided by 17 different insurance companies. Reading through a number of other fire accounts, this was a common practice at the time.
I was unable to find any other references to the fire in the newspapers. I did have access to some other Michigan newspapers from the week of June 13, 1875, but none of them mentioned the fire. Now at this point we're missing two things. First of all, there's no mention of arson as the cause of the fire, and the Rochester Era, which was a local newspaper at the time, appears to have nothing to say on the incident.
I have the issue of the paper from June 17, 1875, which was the first issue after the paper mill fire. However, it makes no reference to the mill burning down. During my research, I was fortunate to meet Samantha Lawerence, who is the Archives and Collections Coordinator at the Rochester Hills Museum at Hoosen Farm. She was able to find that the July 8, 1875 issue of the Rochester Era contained several references to the paper mill fire. It reads, "We understand that the Barnes brothers have concluded to rebuild their paper mill recently burned down in this village with brick. The work of clearing away the debris will commence soon. The work of clearing away the debris of the Barnes paper mill has commenced." The Royal Canadian Insurance Company was the largest loser and the first to pay in the Barnes paper mill loss. Applied to M.T. Cole, the auctioneer, for policies. I was hoping to find the June 10, 1875 issue of the Rochester Era, given the possibility that the national papers had the date wrong and the fire actually occurred a few days before June 13th. Unfortunately, neither of the two collections I found for the Rochester Era contained that particular issue, and I found no other news source to suggest a date other than the June 13th. Here is something else to consider about the lack of local comment on the fire. When it comes to understanding history, you can't take modern culture, apply it to a past time, and expect things to make sense. We live in a culture that loves news, and we expect massive amounts of coverage on every event. Today, if there was a major industrial fire, it would be breaking news across the country and lead off every local evening newscast. But back in 1875, fires were incredibly common. While looking for other references to this fire, I looked through 2 weeks of the New York Times in June of 1875. Nearly every day it had a section that listed the destructive fires across the country. Here is the article from June 15, 1875, which included a particular destructive fire from Ludington, Michigan. When the Barnes Brothers paper mill burned that year, everyone in town would have known. Smoke and fire would have been visible from downtown. Rochester's fire department was still about 20 years away, so the fire likely burned for a while. It was not news to the residents of the village that the mill burned down because everyone had probably seen the fire. All that being said, I would think the detail about the fire being arson would have been newsworthy in 1875, so it's still odd that no news stories reported it as so. At this point, we still have one thread to explore though.
Now, even though her name is not up here in the marker behind me, modern tellings of this story mention that the woman arrested for arson was named Anne Strong. Now at this point, contemporary sources from the 1870s don't mention arson as a cause of the fire, but perhaps if I look into her name, I can find some evidence for these claims.
We are told the person who committed the criminal act was a disgruntled employee. This would lead one to look to see if Anne Strong shows up before the fire. Of course, I didn't actually think to do this, but fortunately Samantha Lawerence did know of a few mentions of the name Anne Strong before June of 1875. Indeed, Anne Strong had a connection to the Barnes paper mill. In May 1875, she was caught stealing felting from the mill. 2 articles in the Rochester Era, one on May 6th and one on May 13th, provide details that state that Anne Strong was fined $10 for the incident. It appears that after the fire, Anne Strong disappears from the newspaper record. The newspaper search engines are kind of working against us in this particular case. As mentioned, it can be difficult for computers to figure out the exact text in articles. These search engines try to compensate for this by providing close matches to your phrase. Unfortunately, the name Anne Strong is very close to the incredibly common name Armstrong. So searching for her name returns loads of incorrect results from all over the country.
Now there's still one source we need to check out since we're dealing with a potential criminal case. In the United States, the court system is very good at keeping records. So indeed, if Anne Strong was charged with the destruction of the paper mill, there would be a record of it in the courts. Rochester, Michigan is in Oakland County, so I headed over to the main circuit court building and I found the records retention office in the basement of the courthouse.
In this small office, the court kept official copies of all the court documents going back to the early 1800s when Oakland County was founded. Since this information is all in the public record, I could search through the court docket from 1875. The magic number here is 1217, which is the case number that corresponds to the charge of arson for one Ann Strong. On June 23rd, Ann Strong initially pleaded not guilty to the charge of arson, was assigned a lawyer, and then pleaded guilty to the arson charge. Eventually, she was imprisoned for 10 years. The Oakland County Circuit Court has a large file in this case. I pulled out only a few of the most interesting documents related to it. First up is a complaint filed by William Barnes. He was the Barnes brother who managed the paper mill, and this is the first time in the story we actually hear from him. In this document, he describes the act of arson against his paper mill, but does not provide a reason for why Ann Strong was the person who committed the crime. One note of interest here is that William Barnes describes the fire occurring on June 12th at 2:30 a.m., which would have been a Saturday morning, not the Sunday morning we have concluded from the newspapers. I suppose it is possible he was really referring to 2:30 Saturday night, which would have been a Sunday morning, but it's impossible to tell from this document. Next is the actual arrest warrant that would have been given to the Oakland County Sheriff's Department to arrest Ann Strong. Finally, I have a document instructing the Oakland County Sheriff's Department to have Ann Strong transferred to the jail in Jackson County. We also learn from this document that her sentence included hard labor. Unfortunately, I did not copy any documents which detail why William Barnes believed Ann Strong burned down his factory, or why Ann Strong pled guilty, but the case file at the court contains a lot more information. At some point, the investigation into this story has to be closed. Perhaps in the future I'll return to the court and examine the rest of the details for Ann Strong's case, but for now, this episode will end here.
So what I thought would be a simple process of digging up a few newspaper articles turned out to be a real search for the history behind this marker. I'll put all my source material in the show notes below, in case you want to continue my research. Also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the comments section below the video. But for now, I'm Jason, in Michigan. This has been your history. Thanks for watching.